Now I'm going to talk about one maybe of the most important philosophers in history, that is Aristotle. And he has a huge importance in biology. Why? Because he completely changed the perspective to study biology, because he started doing experiments. And that completely changed our perspective, because he was not only giving arguments, but he was trying to test the ideas and trying to make observations. And he in particular studied the development, and this created an important field in biology. And I'm just going to show you a few things that right now we do in development, and then I will move back to show you what Aristotle proposed. So, for example, do you see this stage 21 of the turtle embryo? Now, as we do experiments, thanks to what Aristotle started doing, now, for example, this is a beautiful picture that we can see in different colors how a turtle embryo look like, and each color indicate something different. So some of genes are expressed in some way, other genes are expressed in another way, and we can follow in detail what happened with the inheritance and with the development of the embryos. So in this slide, I just want to show you that although biology is beautiful, when you go and see and do experiments, you get a new perspective. So what did Aristotle did? It was amazing. So if you have seen Finding Nemo and you have seen coral reef in pictures, or you have visited them, you see that you know that they are completely beautiful. Here I want to show you how beautiful they are when we make movies and we see how they develop. So for example, here we have an emerging Acropora polyp, and you see two colors. The tissue in green will be the coral tissue, and the algae will be in Magneta. So as you can see, studying development show you a different perspective and show you different phenomena and different mechanisms. And I just want to show you more movies to keep going in that idea of the importance of the experiments. And in this case, you can see here a crustacean. And inside of the crustacean, that you can find it in fresh waters or in salt water, you can see that there are other cells that are infecting and are eating this poor animal. And when you have movies and you can do experiments, you can actually understand more in more detail what is happening. And you will see here one that he will leave, he will finish eating, and he will leave the poor crustacean. So to finish this parenthesis and go back to the Greek philosophers and start talking about Aristotle, I just want to tell you that Aristotle and other scientists, what they did is that when you have this major advance in science, is because due to two reasons. One, because there is a major philosophical shift, or there is a major methodological shift. So in Aristotle's case, it was both. He said, like, instead of talking and talking, and can do experiments, and although he didn't have microscopes, he said, what about if we study a model organism? So we study in biology and do experiments and study big cells. And I will show you how you study big cells to try to study inheritance. And just remember, only when we know how to question nature, we can get her to reply. It's a pretty quote, and I think this is what Aristotle did. To start talking about Aristotle, I just remind you that we talk about Pythagoras and we talk about Hippocrates. And if you remember, Pythagoras talked about the likeness factor, and then Hippocrates, he talked about pangenesis. And what Aristotle did is systematically dismantle the Pythagoras ideas. So he said no. And then he also rejected Hippocrates' ideas of pangenesis as a mechanism of inheritance. So papers, remember this one, the likeness, he said no, this is not correct. And he also reject these ideas of pangenesis. So now let's start talking about Aristotle. So Aristotle was active a century after Hippocrates. So he rejected all his ideas, but Hippocrates didn't have any way to defend his ideas because he was not alive anymore. And he wrote this very influential book that it was gender generation of animals and deal with problems in both genetics and development. So he was able to link the ideas of genetics and the ideas of developmental biology that now actually is a field called developmental genetics that is very important right now. But of course, he didn't know anything about genes. He didn't know anything about process that take place during development, like cell division, cell death. He didn't know anything about these things. So he was the founder of these fields. So Aristotle challenged Pythagoras' ideas, and remember the vapors? The vapors form like a traveling library. And he said, this is wrong. And he showed it in multiple ways. So one way that he showed is like, so Pythagoras will say, this, do you see this eye color is very similar in the kid because the vapors will be inherited. But Aristotle said, what about when the eye color come from the mom? How do you explain those things? And what about when they come not only from the grandfather, so the trait skip a generation, and when they come from the grandmother, what happened? So he said, you know, Pythagoras is wrong because maybe some features can skip generation, and in some cases the children can inherit features from the mothers and the grandmothers. So in that way, he said Pythagoras is not completely right. And in addition to that, he said, okay, and let's think about the vapors. So the vapors create the male, but what happened with the female? What happened with the female anatomy if we are inherit vapors from the male, and now you have a baby, but the baby is a female, so you are inheriting the traits of a male. So how female anatomy appear, how it originates. So second thing that Aristotle challenged Pythagoras ideas is through the female to the female anatomy. That it could be the most logical one because the vipers cannot possibly account for the female anatomy. And Aristotle have a dramatically different approach to this problem. So he proposed that both male and females they mutually contribute to the progeny. So, and he proposed this metaphor. He said the males are like a seed, and the female are like the soil, and they produce the raw materials, water, nutrient, etc. While the male is going to have the instructions. So imagine that you are making a building. So the male is going to give the architectural plans. So you the architectural plans for a building, while the female is going to give the construction materials. And this was the main idea of Aristotle. So let's quickly recap. So Aristotle proposed a completely different idea that it was that both mutually contribute to the progeny. And how they contribute, we have a metaphor of making a building. To produce a building, the male will have the instructions, like the architectural plan, while the female will have the construction materials. In this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this contribution of the male and then the female in the Aristotle ideas of inheritance. And I'm going to focus on this concept of dynamics. And I want that you remember, if you have seen a movie of an embryo of human developing, you notice that what you see there is movement. And this is what Aristotle saw, that it was one important factor of inheritance was movement, because he was studying embryos of chicken, that is maybe one of the biggest cells that we can see during development. So Aristotle thought about movement, and he thought about that the female produced the raw materials, and the raw materials were it was the female semen, that it was the menstrual blood, and the menstrual blood will be cooked and shaped by the vital heat of the semen. And what is that? So I want that you think about a soup. When you're cooking a soup, you see that it's boiling and it's moving. So what Aristotle thought is that in some way when he was analyzing those chicken embryos, he saw a lot of movement and he said like, these two are interacting and producing something new. And he thought that while minerals are not moving, animals and plants, living organisms have this interaction, this movement, and that is unique. So he saw that both male and females interact, and he did that by doing observation that I will show you in a second. And as a result of this interaction, they have this capacity of produce this offspring with the same form as the parents. So to summarize, and I will keep talking a little bit more in the following slides, Aristotle believed that the embryo was formed from the menstrual blood and the interaction with the male factor that he called the male dynamic. Remember, as he saw so much movement, that it was present in the semen. So let's keep talking a little bit more about that. So one key point of Aristotle is that if you remember these ideas of the raw materials, so he used core observations and correlations. So he used observations, question, hypothesis, and experiments. And one observation, as I said before, is that women are important. The female component is very important. So you can find that there are traits that are found in the kids that come from the mother or from the grandmother. Another thing that he observed is that when women stop menstruating, they generally is an indication that they are pregnant. So in these two cases, he made those correlations and said, the female also contribute to the progeny. So two ways that he proved it: children often carry mother traits or maternal grandparent traits. And the second one, women stop menstruating, and when that happens, it's because they are pregnant. Why? Because this material is used to build a fetus. And remember, although he was the first one who started doing experiments, the scientific method is not properly shaped, so there is a lot of things that have to be done in terms of the analysis and the conclusions, and there is still a lot of metaphysical aspect of his theory. In this slide, I'm going to talk about Aristotle, and I'm going to focus on the experiment that he did and how those experiments allow him to answer just two basic developmental questions. And what he did is to use as a model organism the chicken embryos. And the chicken embryos, if you see here, they are changing over time. And they have a very dynamic process. So if you remember the example of the soup, that the soup was boiling, so it start moving, and you see that there is a lot of movement. If you open a chicken, what you see is the same thing, that the cells are moving, that the tissue is changing. So instead of having here, you see a chicken, and at the end you have a chicken. But later I will show you the early stages, and I will show you a movie of how the chicken embryo developed, and in the beginning it doesn't look at all like a chicken. So he, with this studies, he started the field of embryology. And he wrote this in a book called The History of Mammalian. Okay, so let's recap these few ideas that I just told you. So I told you that Aristotle did experiments, and the experiment that he did is he opened chicken eggs at various time points of incubation. So in addition to do all this observation, question, and hypothesis, he tried to do experiments to test those questions, to answer those hypotheses. And what he noted is that the organism that he was studying, they display a change over time. And finally, he started studies of embryology, and he wrote his findings in a book called the Historia de Animalium. I don't speak Latin, sorry, so I don't know how it's actually pronounced properly, but this is the name. And with these experiments, Aristotle, as I said before, answered two main developmental questions, and I will show you those two questions. The first question, and if you want to see it here, when you compare the early stages with the late stages, the first question is what happened during the embryogenesis? Just growth? And the organisms are just growing and growing and growing? Or so they go from a small to a large animal, or something else happened? Maybe a stepwise process of progressive organization and increasing complexity. So this is the second question. So if you see here, there is an increase in complexity that go from a low complexity to a high complexity. So here you don't see eyes or legs or feathers or beaks or anything like that. However, during development, there is a stepwise process that creates all these structures. And for us, the answer is very clear. This is the thing that happened in this organism. And but for them, that was something completely new. And he was the first one who actually started testing using experiments to test ideas. And in the following slide, I'm going to show you a video of how chicken embryos develop so you can have a better idea of what he saw. So now I'm sure that this is clear for you that maybe this could happen only at the end. Yeah, but if you see the entire process, actually the one that is right is this one. So it's not only simple growth, what is happening is a progressive organization in complexity. And these last experiments allow us to introduce the next class, that is, what is transmitted, miniatures or messages. So are we transmitted just tiny people that are growing larger and larger? And that will be the next question that we will answer. Or are we transmitted information? So we have information and that information is changing, something similar that happened with the DNA. So in the next class, we will answer that question. I hope that you enjoyed this class, and we will be